So this is a Vaush video called Black Cops Are Still Cops, and most of the start of the video is actually fine, because it's not about men or men's issues. He's saying that black cops killing a black man can still be racist because it's systemic racism, so even though it's people of the same race, it is still racist. And yeah, he's got a point, like he's basically right about that. But then he starts talking about other things.
Maybe not guaranteed, but at least systemically, probabilistically, there's a decent chance that if he was white and in a white area, that he would have been able to get care in time. This is one of the issues with systemic analysis. It's very rarely do you get to apply these denunciations to case-by-case situations.
Okay, talking about race, so far so good. Now here we go.
Right? So, for example, violence against women.
So what will make more sense than that is exactly the opposite, right? Like, men are far more likely to be victims of violence. You could say that's a form of systemic disadvantage. And even mostly at the hands of other men, in the same way that this particular black man was killed by black members of the police force. In fact, it's literally the exact situation of the case that he's talking about, the Tyree Robinson case, right? Because he was, indeed, a black man killed by black police. He was also a man killed by male police. It is very literally exactly the same situation. But that is very much not the point that Vaush is going to be trying to make.
Violence against women is bad.
There is a principle of rhetoric that to express one thing is to exclude others. In this case, to say that violence against women is bad implies that it's bad because it's happening to women, which coincidentally happens to be something that Vaush very much believes in. After all, why else state violence against women is bad, rather than violence is bad? For that matter, why does the term violence against women even exist? Women are far safer than men, in fact, in every single case, in every age group, in every profession, in every situation, women are overwhelmingly safe. So why does the term violence against women exist other than to segregate violence into the majority that people like Vaush don't care about, and the specific type of violence that happens to women, which matters because it happens to women?
Now, violence against women is often considered to be kind of like a specific category, because most violence, of course, is in between men, if we're talking about assaults and murders and what have you.
Yes, male-on-male crime, the feminist version of black-on-black crime, because feminists are really just conservatives, but targeting men.
We have violence against women in a kind of implied they didn't deserve it category, which is not always the case, but often is. You know, when we're talking about violence against women, we're not talking about like a 50-50 coin flip on whether the woman was like doing some violence herself and deserved it or whatever, or was being defended against.
Is the implication, because it seems like the implication there is that male crime victims are asking for it? I mean, that's fucking victim blamey as fuck, is that, mate?
It's pretty straightforward in a lot of cases. But not in every case, you know? If you have a domestic dispute which leads to a violence against a woman, how often can you fairly claim that the violence done against her was a product of misogyny or chauvinism?
So this is the Duluth model, or more broadly referred to as the gender hypothesis, the idea that domestic violence and other things commonly described as violence against women are motivated by patriarchy or a desire of men to maintain power or other gender factors rather than just the things that cause all violent crime. And, unfortunately for Vaush, there is absolutely no evidence for the gender hypothesis. In fact, the woman who led the team that codified it into the Duluth model has disowned her own work and described it in terms that basically amount to confirmation bias. They manipulated the evidence. They asked questions that got answers they didn't like, so they just asked different questions instead. But the reality is that domestic violence is just a type of violent crime, and it's caused by exactly the same factors as any other type of violent crime. Substance abuse, economic anxiety, previous instance of violence against the perpetrator, and of course various adverse childhood events. And you know the leading risk factor for women becoming victims of domestic violence? It's physically assaulting their male partners. So, in other words, it's exactly the opposite of the situation Vaush was suggesting. It's not that male criminals are more likely to be responsible for their victimisation, quite the opposite. It's that female victims of domestic violence are uniquely likely to be partly responsible for their victimisation.
But when we talk about violence against women broadly, we are talking about misogyny, aren't we?
Are we? Because to me it seems like we're talking about female privilege. That might be a bit of a controversial thing to say, but the reality is that there's no such thing as violence against women as a category. Violence, of course, can happen to women, but violence against women is the same thing as violence against white people. It's a form of violence which happens, certainly, but it's also a form of violence which happens against a group who are unusually safe. Not more likely, but less likely to be victims of violence. But I suppose in this video there's a reason that Vaush isn't talking about violence against white people. But not a reason of consistent principle or philosophy, but just because he thinks that it would be reacted to worse by his audience. And then Vaush goes back to talking about racism again, and the difference between systemic and interpersonal racism, and how this could have been about racism despite being done by black people. And he's largely right about all that. The only problem here is that he apparently thinks that women are in the same position as black people. He's able to see the greater risk of violence that happens to black people and that black people suffer for what it is. But the greater risk of violence that men suffer, he just can't see. He can't bring himself to accept that. It has to be a matter of women and not men being victimised. And yeah, this is a very consistent weak point of Vaush. It's something he is consistently and extremely wrong about, as we've seen before.